All right, this class is going to be over the first couple of classes that we're going to have for this one are going to be over what you're going to do with the world now that World War II is over. Right? So we're going to be looking at that, and the first couple of classes are going to be setting the groundwork for it. That is, if you look at the long-term period between about 1945 and today, you're going to see that the way the United States is going to be involved in the world is going to work according to the core principles we're going to lay out in these two sets of the first two essay topics. One is you're going to see the creation of a new economic system based off of free trade. That's what your class is going to be over today. The second is going to be a new national security foreign policy system that's going to be based off of a number of points. And all of those principles, both classes are going to boil down to essentially the same thing, an attempt to apply the principles laid out in the 14 points address that Woodrow Wilson gave at the end of World War One. So I'm going to give you in your class today, why is it that the leadership of the United States focused in on doing this in 1945? Then we're going to go into how it worked. That is, what did they think that? Why did they think for the free trade would be a good system to work with? How did they try to put it into effect? That is, what kind of institutions do they need in order to make free trade work? And why it became unpopular. That is, you look over the last 20 years, there has been a real reaction against this free trade globalizing system. And this is because there were a number of unintended consequences that went along with it. We're going to look at those towards the end of the class. So anyway, with that, let's start by picking up at World War One. Where we left off in your last class, we went over why the Allies won World War II. I mean, sorry, World War II. When we went over your last class, we went over why the Allies won World War II. So now let us put yourself at the end of World War II. You're part of the victorious American army coming into Germany, or maybe 4 months late, they would have been coming in May of 1945. Or about 3, 4 months later, you would see the victorious American armies coming into Japan by September. So if you're a part of that army, what would you see all around you? You'd see a lot of this. Because if you'd have gone around the world in 1945, you would have seen a lot of ruin. And let's start with the guys who lost. One of the if you were in the world economy of 1945, essentially it was centered around a handful of industrial areas. These were the places that came to power during the Second Industrial Revolution. These were the people who led the new imperialism. There's the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan. So let's look at how they were doing in 1945. Let's start with Germany. They were one of the big countries that lost World War II. Germany was led by a leader named Adolf Hitler who had grandiose plans over what he was going to do with Germany. He fancied himself an architect, so he thought he could draw up a society better than the one that existed before. Here you see the plans they had for the new Reichstag in Berlin once they rebuilt Berlin after the war. This is what Berlin actually looked like after the war. That is, it just got flattened. American and British bombers bombed it pretty constantly for 2 years before the war finally ended. About April of 1945, starting about the last 10 days of April, the Soviet army reached Berlin and they blew the crap out of it. That is, they brought in about I think 3 million men. They brought in a lot of artillery. The Soviet way of fighting a war is just to blow everything up in their path. Berlin got in the way. So if you were looking at Berlin or any place in Germany, you were looking at a place in ruins by 1945. And if you ever tour Germany, you can still see kind of the remnants of that. That is, if you go into most of the big cities of Germany, you'll just see hills that show up out of nowhere. That is, there's just a hill there, doesn't really fit the landscape. What those hills are the bomb damage. That is, there was so much bomb damage in the cities after the Allies got through with them. They just took the wreckage, piled it up, and shoveled dirt over it because they couldn't move it all out, and those became hills afterwards. Also, if you were to walk around in Germany in 1945, it's hard to see from this picture, but you would have seen women walking around wearing basically everything that they owned. Actually, most of men would be doing the same thing. You would see people wearing multiple sets of clothing. That was because their houses were destroyed. They figured if they weren't wearing it, it was going to get stolen. I mentioned women before because if you were in Germany in the summer of 1945, you would have hardly seen any men. Most of the men that were drafted were in prisoner of war camps by the summer of 1945, and those that weren't in prisoner of war camps were dead, so they definitely weren't coming back. So one of the big losers of World War II, Germany, was in ruins. They were actually worried about starvation by the time you get to the end of 1945. Japan wasn't any better off because during the war, the United States, starting around March in 1945, started doing something called area bombing, which is they didn't bother to aim for targets on the ground. They just aimed to bomb indiscriminately to destroy the enemy's ability in order to keep the war going. Japan was a society where the cities were largely built out of wood and paper. The Americans dropped bombs on them designed to start fires. They were primarily made using something called napalm. Napalm is jellied gasoline, and once it catches on fire, it just sticks to everything and stays on fire. One of the biggest of those bombing raids was in Tokyo, where in March of 1945, they hit Tokyo, burned down most of the city, killed about 135,000 people. By August, they had gotten to the point where they didn't even need all the bombers. They had developed the atomic bomb. They could destroy an entire city with one shot. So if you'd have gone through Japan by the fall of 1945, it was just a parking lot. Everything was destroyed within it. But those are the losers. Let's take a look at how the winners are doing in the summer of 1945. One of the big winners of World War II was the USSR, the Soviet Union, Communist Russia. At the end of the war, their armies occupied most of Eastern Europe. They occupied the eastern part of Berlin, right? And they were the second most powerful nation in the world by the end of World War II. However, in June of 1941, a huge German army invaded it with the goal of destroying everything that they ran across. And in order to get rid of the Germans, an even huger Russian army fought their way through Russia in order to push them out. And what you wind up with is a nation in destruction. Cities all over the western part of the Soviet Union, which was the developed part, were in ruins by the end of the war. Millions of civilians were dead. Let me give you let me give you an example for how bad this got. The Germans attacked the second largest city in the Soviet Union, a place at the time called Leningrad. Today it's called St. Petersburg. The Germans, however, did not want to occupy the city because if they did, they would be responsible for the civilians in it. So instead, they surrounded Leningrad and wouldn't let any food into it. What they were hoping was they would starve everyone in the city to death. Leningrad had 6 million people in it in 1941. And this siege went on for 900 days. And by the height of the siege, rations in Leningrad were about 800 calories a day. If you were a soldier or a physical laborer, if you were a common civilian, your rations were 400 salaries a day. Right? About 1 million people died of the delayed reaction of starvation over the course of the next few years. Right? There was such a shortage of food in the Soviet Union during the war that they developed a taste for spam. As the Americans sent food parcels to the Soviet Union, among them included spam. Uh, Apparently became quite a delicacy. It was Nikita Khrushchev's favorite food. He would become dictator of Russia after the war. Anyway, so the Soviet Union was in rough shape at the end of the war. In between Germany and the Soviet Union was Eastern Europe, the nations of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary. Those nations were flattened by a German army as it went east in 1939, and then was flattened again by a Soviet army when it went west in 1944. Net result was ruins everywhere. Like the worst, hardest hit of those areas was Poland. Poland was ground zero of the Holocaust. So the Germans just went medieval on Poland. About 1/6 of the Polish population was dead by the end of World War II, right? With the hardest hit being their Jewish population. One out of every 5 people in Poland was Jewish. When the war started, there were hardly any Jews left in the country by the time the war ended. Western Europe was traditionally the most more developed part of Europe. The most developed part historically of Western Europe was what they call the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium. Those areas were hit really hard by the war. That is, the Germans invaded those countries even though they were neutral in 1940, did a lot of damage. The Germans actually did the first bombing of civilian targets from the air when they hit the Dutch city of Rotterdam in 1940. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, said it was a war crime until American bombers started doing the same thing later on in the war. But once the Germans occupied these countries, the Germans used their factories for German military production. They also based military forces in the occupied countries. So they were a target of bombing. Those American and British bombers hit those countries pretty regularly. Millions of civilians were also drafted by the Germans and forced to work as laborers in German military factories in Germany itself. So these were hundreds of thousands, millions of displaced persons, refugees, those kind of prisoners that by the end of the war were milling around trying to get home. Right? It reached a climax in the Netherlands when the British did something called Operation Market Garden. That is, they had an idea that rather than go through France and repeat World War I, they would invade German occupied territory through the Netherlands. They would then march from the Netherlands to Berlin. You have a shorter trip from the Netherlands to Berlin than you did have from France. So they launched this huge invasion of the Netherlands as a result. What they forgot was why they called the Netherlands the Netherlands. It's called the Netherlands because this is all low-lying areas. Most of the land in the Netherlands was originally part of the North Sea. They just built a series of dikes and dams around the water, pumped out the water, and started farming and building cities on the areas they exposed from the sea. So as soon as the British invaded the Netherlands, the Germans said, okay, we'll just blow up all the dikes and dams, stop the British Army cold, and made the entire nation like Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina. So, one of the most developed parts of the historical world, the Netherlands, Belgium, were flat on their back by the end of the war. Another big economy in the pre-war was France. France was flattened by the German army when they went through in 1940, and then was flattened again by the Americans and British when they went through in 1944. So France, one of the big economies of the world, was in ruins. Great Britain was never occupied. There were never soldiers fighting in Great Britain on the island. Now, the Germans had airplanes. They bombed Britain pretty hard in 1940. This was a bomber campaign called the Blitz. Hit a lot of industrial targets, did a lot of damage. At the end of the war, they couldn't reach with bombers anymore, but they started to use rockets instead. The Germans developed two new types of weapons towards the end of the war. One was a rocket called the V1. The V1 was what we would today call a cruise missile. It was an automatically piloted airplane that would have a bomb in it that would just crash into a target. Their cruise missiles weren't nearly as accurate as what the United States has today because they didn't have computers. Instead, a gyroscope was trying to pilot the plane. The gyroscope wasn't nearly as accurate. But these terrified the British because they would just hit random targets within Britain and they carried pretty powerful bombs. They wound up killing somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 civilians over the course of about 9 months worth of their use. By contrast, in the entire September 11th bombing, the United States lost 3,000 people. Right? So Britain was pretty heavily damaged and was economically taxed by the huge cost of fighting a war. The war was so expensive for them that their entire empire was unsustainable. And they wound up losing the whole thing within 15 years. So the bottom line is you went throughout the world in 1945, you would have seen a giant graveyard. Europe was in ruins. Japan was in ruins. China was in ruins. The entire world was in terrible shape, with one exception. That exception was the United States. In World War II, the United States effectively ended the Great Depression. Every factory was working all out. Unemployment was down to less than 1.5% by the end of the war. And the United States at the end of the war had somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 million men in uniform. Their armies controlled Europe. Their navy controlled the seas. Their aircraft controlled the skies. America was the world's largest creditor. Everyone owed them money. America had the world's biggest economy. Half of all the world's industrial production was in the United States. Right? So America in 1945 was in a position of unprecedented power. Right? They were fully intact. They had everything they needed, and the rest of the world was in trouble. So the leadership of the United States had a rare amount of flexibility. That is, they were at a moment where they could do pretty much anything they wanted. And so what they decided was going to be highly important. And if you were part of the leadership of the United States, not just the president, not just the people in the government, but the entire class of people at the top, right? The college professors, the newspaper editors, the leaders of the big businesses, the bankers, the generals in the army, the admirals in the navy, right? The diplomats in the State Department, the politicians in Congress. A consensus of them in 1945 were all asking the same question, right? What happened? It is World War One, the big event of their one of the big events of their lives so far, was a war so terrible that everyone figured nobody would ever be stupid enough to fight something like that again. They called it the war to end all wars. Now, just 20 years later, they fought a sequel, World War II. And like most sequels, it was bigger, better, and had better special effects than the original. So if you're a leader of the United States, you got to ask yourself, why did you wind up with this horrible war? And a consensus of the leadership of the United States in 1945 had an answer to it. And their consensus answer was America dropped the ball in 1918. Right? What you're looking at here is the 14 points address. I mentioned this in an earlier class as we looked at the 14 points, communism and fascism, the big alternatives to the world after World War I was over. Right? This is an edited version of the speech. I took out the first and last paragraph. They wouldn't fit on the page. But what you got here are the actual 14 points, the 14 specific ideas that Woodrow Wilson wanted in the peace treaty that would end World War I. Right? These 14 points basically boil down to five major ideas, four that are stated and one that is not stated. Right? And those are that that the world should have a new economic system, one based off of free trade. One was that the world should, in the future, limit the amount of arms in the world. It should have arms control. One was that the conquered peoples of the world should get their freedom. And the final part was that the peace-loving nations of the world should come together for common self-defense. That wars are started by criminal nations, rogue states, and that the law-abiding nations of the world needed to come together to stop them. The 14 points proposed creating an international organization called the League of Nations to do it. So this was Woodrow Wilson's idea in order to prevent war in the future. The United States then spent the next 20 years not doing it. Right? That is, once the war is over, rather than create free trade, the United States created a series of tariffs in order to keep out foreign products. The big one being the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 that finally destroyed what was left of the world economy. Rather than ending imperialism, the United States and other nations kept their colonies. They actually divided up the colonies of the Ottoman Empire after that country fell apart. That is, Woodrow Wilson was a product of his time, which meant he was a racist. He believed in self-determination. but for whites only. That is, you look at these points over here, they mention a lot of areas that should be freed. Belgium, a French, German occupied France, uh, Italy, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, okay, Turkey, Poland. Those are the white parts of the world. Free self-determination didn't apply to everyone else. And when they were talking about collective security, that is, that all the freedom-loving nations of the world should come together for common self-defense, the United States refused to get involved. That is the 14th point over here. Creating an international organization was done. They created something called League of Nations. The United States refused to join it. So the leaders of the United States in 1944-45 concluded that because they didn't follow through on the principles of the 14 points after World War I, they wound up with World War II. So if you want to prevent the same thing from happening again, if you want to prevent another war in the future, then what do you need to do? You need to follow through on these points. Right? And that is the common theme we're going to see in the next couple of lectures. They are going to take the principles laid out in the 14 points and create an integrated economic, diplomatic, national security system out of it. And that is what still exists in the world today, 75 years after the end of World War II. Right? And we're going to look at that by dividing into two parts. Today we'll look at the economic part, and in your next class we'll look over the national security diplomatic part. Right? So let's start by looking at the economic part. The economic part was laid out in the third of the 14 points, which calls for a removal of all economic barriers and an establishment of an equality of trade among all nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance, to create a system based off of free trade. Right? The United States used its power after 1944-45 in order to create a world system based off of free trade. Right? They started this by creating an international architecture that is getting the nations of the world in order to write a series of treaties in order to remove barriers for trade between them. And the big event in that was a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference. At Bretton Woods, the economic leaders of the world came together to meet to discuss the post-war rebuilding of the world. You can see that it was a big deal. This is the Soviet and British delegations. The British delegate here is a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He was the world's leading economist in 1944. Right? So all the big shots in the world were there. However, since the United States dominated the world economy, 2/3 of all the delegates at Bretton Woods were Americans. Right? So Bretton Woods was going to shape what the United States wanted. And what the United States wanted was an international system based off of free trade. How it got it was by creating three big institutions in the Bretton Woods agreements. The first institution was a treaty, called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all the big industrial nations agreed that they would lower their taxes on imported industrial products. Right? Their thinking was that if you're a nation like Germany, you did not have a big empire. You were afraid that you couldn't get resources for your factories. That you couldn't get markets for your products. That if you believed that that was the future, then you figured the best thing to do for your nation was to conquer some place that would have resources, take them away from another big nations, and use them as a captive market. Instead, Bretton Woods said if you're a nation like Germany, you could buy anything from anywhere in the world, and you could sell anything anywhere in the world to pay for it, especially industrial products. So Bretton Woods ordered that the nations of the world lower their taxes on industrial products. So other countries could sell to each other or use the money to buy their natural resources. Right? And in a series of agreements afterwards, they have kept on doing that. Let me give you some numbers here. In 1944, when they were meeting at Bretton Woods, the average tax on an imported product in the world, right, that's called a tariff, was 44%. So if you wanted to go to Germany, buy yourself a $10,000 Volkswagen, in America, that car would cost you $14,400. Not 10,000 for the car, 4,400 for the tariff, the tax. Today, the average tariff on a manufactured good in the world is about 8% because they have done a series of treaties that got rid of all those tariffs. 8% is not really a big deal. In Houston, that's the sales tax. And the sales tax hasn't really stopped anybody from buying anything. So, if so Bretton Woods created this general agreement on tariffs and trade, the treaty that would lower tariffs. The general agreements on tariffs and trade also created an international institution to lower other barriers on trade. This is also called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT for short. The bureaucracy was later renamed the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. That's what it's called today. The purpose of that was to keep people from stopping the sale of industrial products through technicalities. And let me explain how that would work. Say that you're the United States. You don't want Japan to sell cars in America, right? In 1930, if you wanted to keep Japanese cars out, you could tax Japanese cars, put in a 40% tax on them. Right? The GATT Treaty says you can't do that. So if you can't tax the Japanese cars out, then how can you keep them out? Well, you could put in a bunch of regulations on foreign products. For example, the United States could put in a regulation that said that all cars sold in the United States have to have 52 airbags. And one airbag for the driver and 51 airbags in case the first one fails. But the regulation could exempt American cars. Right? You could say that this was all done to make a safer car, but really what you wanted was to make the Japanese car more expensive so nobody would buy it. Right? The GATT Treaty says that that's illegal. That is, the GATT Treaty says that any regulation applied to a foreign product has to be applied to a domestic product too. Right? And the World Trade Organization has the authority in order to tell a nation that their rule is unfair and they have to change it. For example, if Toyota says that American rules are unfair to them, they could appeal directly to the World Trade Organization. And if the World Trade Organization agrees with them, then America has to change its laws. That is, in America, treaties are considered part of American jurisprudence. So a judge in America would order you to obey it. Right? So you have at Bretton Woods the creation of these institutions under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, an agreement to lower taxes on imported products, a bureaucracy to make sure that other mechanisms wouldn't be used to keep imported products out. But the Bretton Woods Agreement also created a couple of other institutions. One of them was a new bank called the World Bank. The World Bank was a bank that was designed to raise money to send to underdeveloped nations, okay, the former colonies of the world. That is, colonies were starting to get their freedom from their mother countries after World War II. India became free of Britain in 1947. The Philippines got free of the United States in 1946. These countries did not have development, so they could not take part in this new world economy. So what the United States did was they created a bank called the World Bank. The big nations of the world would fund it. The World Bank could then give loans to poorer nations to build things that would enable them to take part in this new world economy. What could they build? Well, let's look at one example. In the Middle East, there's a nation called Egypt. Egypt was undeveloped. So Egypt wanted a way to get electricity. So their plan was to build a dam on the Nile. It was called the Aswan High Dam. So they went to the World Bank and got the World Bank to give them a loan to build the dam. They then built the dam, and today the Aswan High Dam provides around one quarter of all Egypt's electricity. So the World Bank could do that, things like that, finance the construction of electrical plants, ports, railroads, right, airports, so on and so forth. Right? Enable poorer nations to take part in this new world economy. The Bretton Woods Agreement also created a third institution. It was called the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund was going to be a lender of last resort. Right? That is, when the Depression was breaking out in 1930-31, a lot of nations got into trouble. That is, they could not pay off their debts. So what they wound up doing was defaulting on the debts. That starting with Austria in 1931. That deepened the world financial crisis, and what's one of the things that made the Depression as bad as it was. So after 1944, though, when the International Monetary Fund gets created, if you've got a nation and you get in trouble, you could go to the International Monetary Fund, right, and get a loan from them. They're the lender of last resort. Even if every bank in the world won't talk to you, you could go to them and get a loan. In return, they will give you some reforms that they want carried out in order to make sure that you get out of trouble. Right? So the United States creates these institutions at Bretton Woods, hoping that this would create a new world economy based off of free trade, where goods made anywhere in the world could be sold anywhere in the world. Right? And that this would rebuild the world economy, it would prevent a future depression and prevent a future war. By 1947, it looked like that plan was going to fail. That was because the world was just in such rough shape. As the European economies, especially, were so heavily damaged by the war that just the promise of export markets wasn't enough to get them rebuilt. So they were teetering along. And by 1947, it looked like all of Europe was going to collapse. So the leadership in the United States was at a crossroads. They basically had two options. Option number one was that they could give up. Option number two was they could double down. That is, they had spent some money, they'd put in a lot of resources to get this new world economy together. If it wasn't working yet, they would put in more money in order to get it working. The option they picked was two. That is, in 1947, the American Secretary of State George Marshall announced the creation of the European Recovery Program, right? Which is it's usually referred to in the history books as the Marshall Plan. What the Marshall Plan did was it gave loans to nations in Europe to help them rebuild. Right? How much did they give in loans? Well, the Marshall Plan in 1947 dollars amounted to somewhere in the neighborhood of $13 billion. The United States also gave $9 billion in other economic aid. That would be about $22 billion. In today's money, right, $22 billion in 1947 was about 8% of the gross domestic product of the United States. And today, the equivalent of that would have been about $1.07 trillion. So essentially, the United States loaned Europe $1 trillion in order to rebuild themselves. The terms of the loan was such that the United States said Europe didn't actually have to pay the money back. So basically, the Marshall Plan gave Europe $1 trillion to rebuild itself. If you're in the United States, why do you do that? Well, one reason why would be if you're in America, you are afraid of round two of the Depression. When the war ended, most Americans weren't convinced that the Depression was over. They figured they were just at halftime. The war had temporarily ended the Depression and then it would start up again. So American leaders were afraid that if Europe collapsed completely, you would get a second depression. That is, it would wind up like it did in 1933. 1930, when after Smoot-Hawley, when Europe collapsed, you wind up getting with an even worse collapse in America, right? But also, the Americans had something else that was bothering them. And that was, if these nations in Europe completely collapsed, are those Europeans just going to wait around for 20 or 30 years for things to straighten themselves out? Probably not. Instead, they would look for another alternative, some other way in order to get themselves back on their feet. Who could offer an alternative, right, to the Europeans? Well, how about these guys over here? Right? The Soviets, the communists, are offering or an alternative. Get rid of private property, then you get rid of all your problems. If Europe collapses, then Europeans will be desperate enough in order to take that option. The United States will be isolated in the world. Right? So the American leadership decided that they were going to spend the money. And it worked. The Marshall Plan got the European economy restarted. Right? So by the time you get to 1952, you have an international architecture in the world that enables free trade to occur, that goods can go from one place to another. You have European nations that are big enough to take part of it. A similar program was sent to Japan, so the big industrial economies of the world are back on their feet. And then in the years that followed, they're going to build other institutions in order to make free trade work as well. One institution they're going to build is going to be involving transportation. Right? As the cost of transporting goods is going to radically decline in the 75 years between World War II and today. And the key development in that was the development of something called the container ship. Right? And let me explain how this works. In 1945, World War II, say you had a gun in Cleveland, you just made it in a factory, and you wanted to send that gun to Britain. Right? It was going to a British military base. So how it would get there was you would take your gun, say it's a big artillery piece, you put it on a truck, you drive the truck to the railroad station. You would then put it on a railroad car. The railroad would then take the truck to New Jersey. In New Jersey, the gun would be unloaded off of the railroad car and put on another truck. That truck would then drive it across the bridge into New York City. In New York City, it would then drive to a pier. If you've ever been to New York, they have avenues that run north and south and streets that run east to west. Up until the 1970s, every street ended in a pier. So you would drive your truck over to the pier, you would unload your gun at the dock. It would wait for a ship. Then stevedores would load up the ship, your gun would go on it. When the ship was full, it would then steam across the Atlantic to Southampton or Liverpool in Britain. There, the ship would be unloaded. Your gun would go back on the dock. Eventually, somebody would take the gun, put it on a truck, take it to a railroad station, be put on a railroad car, sent to its final destination. That trip would take a long time, probably about a month, and it would cost a lot of money. Right? Fast forward to 1954. A trucker named Malcolm McLean had an idea. McLean, he was a not when I say trucker, I don't mean he drove a truck. I mean he owned a trucking company. He had a big trucking company in North Carolina that was getting bigger because he was kind of an innovator. Anyway, McLean had an idea. He went to an auction and bought four of these. This is a World War II oil tanker. And as they used these boats over here to transport oil during the war, the government had a lot of them and was selling them for scrap. So McLean bought himself four of them. He then bought some stainless steel boxes. He put into the stainless steel boxes goods. He then had cranes take the stainless steel boxes and put them on the deck of these tankers. He then had the tanker steam from New Jersey to Houston. This was the first commercial use of something called the container ship. And by doing so, Malcolm McLean revolutionized the world. Right? Because if you look at that first example, taking the gun to England, the most expensive part of that whole trip was loading and unloading the ship in the port. that is in New York, you would have to wait for weeks to get that ship loaded. While you're waiting, goods on the dock can be stolen. Right? It was labor intensive, so you had to pay a lot of people in order to load that ship. And then on the other end, you had to do it all over again. Now with a container ship, let's see how it worked. You make your artillery piece in your gun factory in Cleveland. Then you put it in a stainless steel box. You then have a crane put that stainless steel box on the back of a flatbed railroad car. You then take the flatbed railroad car and have the train take it to the port of New Jersey. There, another crane will take it off of the flatbed railroad car and put it onto the deck of a container ship. Once the container ship is full, it then goes to Southampton or Liverpool in England, where a crane will then take the box off of the flatbed container car and then put it onto the back of a flatbed truck or a flatbed railroad car, and then it gets to its final destination. A trip that used to take a month now takes a few days, and the cost of it is radically lower. And if you can do that, you have now made it possible to manufacture even relatively cheap crap and sell it around the world. Right? Without a container ship, Walmart, as we know it, is impossible. Right? You couldn't sell something cheap for $1, something that you would have in a dollar store, say, and be able to make any money off of it because the shipping costs would be so high. But with the container ship, you can do that. By the way, in order to make these container ships work, they didn't become dominant until the 1970s. They had to put billions of dollars into infrastructure in order to put up cranes on docks, build new port facilities. The old port facilities weren't designed to do this. But American capital was willing to do that. Generally, if you can replace labor with machinery, business will pay for it. Right? So, what do we got so far? We've got the American government negotiating a treaty system to enable free trade to work. That same treaty system creates institutions that are going to regulate free trade in order to make sure that governments don't go through the back door in order to block it. The United States has funded nations to participate in free trade in Europe and in Japan by helping them rebuild. You now have a transportation system that makes free trade work even for cheap products. And then you're going to see the development of another institution. Right? It is something called the multinational corporation. Right? And let me give you an example. In the 1950s, two engineers in Japan had an idea. Okay? Their names were Ibuka and Morita. Forgot their first names. Their idea was to manufacture transistor radios. In 1948, the transistor was invented in the United States. And by the 1950s, transistor radios became a very popular thing in the world. A transistor radio was a radio that was much smaller than the units that existed in the 1930s and 40s. You could actually fit one in your pocket. So Akia and Morita and Ibuka, sorry, were going to create a company to create transistor radios. Their initial name for the company was Tokyo Electronics Firm, but then they renamed it. And what they decided to rename it was Sony. Right? The decision was made, by the way, by Morita. He was the marketing guy. So let's look at why they named it Sony, because it tells you a lot about that new institution, the multinational corporation. If you're, and any of you have ever taken Japanese, you know what the word Sony means in Japanese. It doesn't mean a goddamn thing. There is no Japanese word Sony. So what does the word Sony mean in English? Nothing. There is no English word Sony. If you look at French, what's a French word Sony mean? Nothing. German. There is no German word Sony. Spanish. No Spanish word Sony. That is, you go through every language in the world, you will not find the word Sony. So why is they Ibuka and Morita naming their company Sony? They decided to name it Sony because no language has it, so a word Sony. And let's go through their thinking. They decided that where they were going to sell their transistor radios was everywhere. That is, they were going to put them on boats, send them throughout the world. Their biggest market was going to be the United States because the United States was the biggest market. They did not want their products to be identified as Japanese because in the mid 1950s, Japan was not the most popular nation in the world, right? So they deliberately picked as a name for their product a word that is easily pronounceable in any language, but that doesn't mean anything in any language. Right? What the word Sony would mean would be defined by whatever marketing they put in a local country, right? Whatever advertising they did. In America, they used these dolls to try to market them. This is called Sony Boy. You can see these on eBay. They sell for about $200 now. And when I showed this picture to classes, they had a mixed reaction. Some people think they're cute, others think they're creepy. Uh, that is, think about how you can see that in the world today. How many products do you have used that have names that basically are meaningless? Okay, they're just a collection of sentences that don't really mean anything. Like especially if you take medication, you see this all the time. What is a Flonase? Right? By the way, Sony did actually mean something in Japanese. Uh, it was kind of a joke. In Japan, the Japanese word for a hipster was a sunny boy. A sunny boy would actually be dressed like this doll, wearing a shirt with a collar like this type of coloring. So when they named it, so when they put out the dolls, what they're putting out is Sony Boy. So they were making kind of a little bit a joke that nobody outside of Japan would get, but they were getting an idea that if they're going to be marketing internationally, their company can't be identified with any particular part of the world, any particular nation. That is, their company's jurisdiction was going to be worldwide. And you can see this basic idea everywhere. For example, the big company we looked at earlier in the semester as an example was Standard Oil of New Jersey. From the name Standard Oil in New Jersey, you could tell it was an American company. They picked the word standard because it had a specific meaning in the English language. In 1973, though, Standard Oil of New Jersey renamed itself Exxon. Exxon is just a collection of syllables that don't mean anything in any language. It's a name you pick if you don't want to be identified with any part of the world, if you operate everywhere. Right? And think in terms of, like, say, your parents or people you know. How many of them work for a company like that? A company where they have offices everywhere. When they get on conference calls at work, they got people from multiple time zones in there, from three different continents. Right? And this is something that is necessary in order to make an international economy work. That is, you're going to have companies that have the bureaucracy, the administrative capacity to operate in multiple different parts of the world that aren't identified with any particular part of the world. Okay? So by the time you get into the 1960s, you have a lot of the preconditions you need to make a free trade economy work. You got the treaty system, you got the international bureaucracies, you've got countries to participate in it, you've got a transportation system that can move cheap products around, you have companies that can operate across multiple borders. And you need one more thing. The one more thing you need is an information system. Right? Getting a message around in 1945 was hard. Even something like the telephone wasn't available in most places. That is, historically, the telephone was primarily used for business. Most American homes didn't have them before you get to the 1950s. And things like telephone and telegraph communication internationally was something that was, by our standards today, pretty primitive. If you ever seen any old war movies or seen the old MASH TV show, you see what I mean. It was very difficult for them to communicate. They had to get special schedule phone calls. If you are operating in multiple jurisdictions at the same time, you need a better transportation system than that. So they created one. Between 1945 and 2020, we've seen tremendous advances in communication. The first of which these was the development of the transistor. The transistor allowed uh, electronic messages over phone lines, like telegraph and telephone communications, to be reproduced better, right, and cheaper. So the quality of telephone and telegraph communications improved throughout the 1950s as transistors became more and more used in them. And then in 1960, the United States launched the world's first communication satellite, Telstar, which enabled radio signals to bounce off the satellite and bounce to the other end of the world. Right? So between the improved wired communication and uh, the communication satellites, you have a far better communication system by the late 60s than you had before. And then they made the really big innovation. The really big innovation came from another use of the transistor, which was the digital computer. Digital computers were starting to become used by corporations by the 1960s. And by the end of the 60s, they started to realize that you could network them together over large distances. The first attempt at this was done by an agency in the United States government called the Advanced Research Projects Administration, or ARPA for short. In December of 1969, they tied together defense research facilities at four colleges: Stanford, the University of Utah, UCLA, and the University of California, Santa Barbara, into something called the ARPANET. They would, as the 70s went on, expand the ARPANET. By 1980, the ARPANET was divided into two pieces. One was military parts of the ARPANET were broken off and put separately into something called MILNET. Everything else was put into something we today call the internet. Right? So now that you have this internet, you now have revolutionary communications. It makes communications much simpler and much cheaper. Right? For example, in 1986, which wasn't that long ago, when I was in college, a long distance call cost 25 cents a minute. Right? So you actually had to budget when you were making a long distance call. Today, a long distance, and that's within the United States. You call it internationally, it costs even more. Today, essentially, those things are free. That is, if you got a good, decent cellular plan, long distance is thrown in with it. Or if you've got the internet, if you got Skype or something like that, you can make long distance calls pretty much for free. Okay? And think in terms of what it means for a business. If you were in World War II, you were in London, you thought you were losing the war, and you wanted to get $1 billion from London to the United States, you would have to get $1 billion worth of gold from the vault. You'd have to put it in a ship, sail the ship across the Atlantic, and then unload the gold once you got to New York and put it in a vault here. If you want to send $1 billion from London to New York today, you press a button on a keyboard. That is, the whole thing is done electronically. Right? So this new communication system revolutionized how capital was sent across international borders. Right? You can sell something in one country and send the money home. Right? So with all of these innovations, you have created a situation where the idea of 1945 can be made a reality. You can have the entire world tied into a globalized economic system based off of free trade. And this system has created a number of successes. Like, for one thing, the world economy has steadily grown since 1945. It is bigger today than it was 75 years ago. And this economic growth has hit all parts of the world, particularly poorer parts. Poorer parts of the world are much less poor today than they were 75 years ago. Okay, places like India, China. For the United States, if you go into a grocery stores carry products from all over the world. There's no such thing as out of season anymore, because if you're in the wintertime here, it's in the summertime in the southern hemisphere. If you go into Walmart, all that stuff in the Walmart came in from someplace else, right? And above all, the whole system was designed in 1945 to prevent war. And in that, it was overwhelmingly successful because it tied together the interests of all the major nations. Right? For example, say the United States and China, the two most powerful nations in the world today, decided that they wanted to start a war with each other. That would be bad. Let's see what it would mean for them. If you are China, you hold $3.5 trillion worth of American securities, right? U.S. Treasury bonds that you got from trading with the United States over the years. Right? So if you declare war on the United States could just say, screw you, we're not paying the bonds back. So if you're China, what does that mean for you? It means that you are totally screwed. Right? And on the flip side, say the United States says we want to go to war with China. China can then say, okay, then screw you, we're not going to sell you anything. What would happen to every Walmart in the country if they couldn't access Chinese products? You'd have shortages of everything, prices of everything would skyrocket. Basically, that kind of did happen during the worst of the coronavirus. That is when trade from China got cut off. You did wind up seeing shortages of a lot of stuff, okay, especially for things like medical gear. So basically, the United States and China today are in a mutual suicide pact. If one goes down, they both go down. And that is basically true of every big nation in the world, which was the design of 1945. So you can look at that economic system it created in 1945, see a lot of benefits from it, and see that it did in fact work out the way it was intended to do. However, you can also look around the world today and see that this economic system based over free trade is very unpopular. Arguably, that was the central issue in the 2016 presidential elections, where Donald Trump was arguing against free trade, right? So that the United States got a raw deal off of it. At the same time, in Britain, they were having an election over something called Brexit, whether or not to leave the European Union. To the surprise of everybody, the British public said, screw the European Union, we want out. Right? That is, you've seen, go all over the world over the last 10, 12 years, you have seen anti-globalization protests. That is, people who looked at the world economic system that was all tied together through free trade and thought it sucked. Right? And let's look into why. And let's start off by looking at okay, some of the basic problems that come up with globalization. Right? That is, when you create the system, a system based off of free trade, you wind up unleashing a lot of forces that have had a lot of negative consequences. Right? The first one we want to look at is what the globalization has done to national sovereignty. Right? That is, as free trade has increased throughout the world, countries have found that they don't have the amount of power to control what happens in their own borders that they used to. Right? For example, in the United States, those World Trade Organization rulings have legal standing. So the United States can't go past them. Right? Every time that happens, that creates a bunch of controversy. Right? And nations find that they are limited in what they can do because of their global commitments. Let me give you a quick example. The picture you're looking at was from South Korea in 1998. South Korea in 1998 had a financial crisis that was triggered by the collapse of an investment fund in the United States. Okay? When they had this financial crisis, South Korea went to the International Monetary Fund in order to get a series of loans, in order to get them through the crisis. The International Monetary Fund would said they would only give them the money if they did a series of reforms. Those reforms were to cut their civilian spending, uh, cut their pensions, and have their companies fire a lot of people. This created demonstrations throughout South Korea, and they couldn't do anything about it because either they did what the IMF wanted or they didn't get any money. And nation after nation has found the same thing out. That is, once they're in this globalization system, that their flexibility is a lot less than it used to be. And give you a few consequences of that. The United States in 1934 passed a law called the Glass-Steagall Act. This was a law designed to regulate banking. That is, the depression was caused by financial crisis. And in the 60 years the Glass-Steagall Act was in effect, the United States did not have a similar financial crisis again. You did not have a depression. In 1999, though, Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. 9 years later, in 2008, you had the financial crisis of 2008. You had the worst recession since the Great Depression as a result. So why did they repeal the Glass-Steagall Act? Well, the big banks in New York told them, either you repeal this banking regulation, or we're moving the banks to the Bahamas or to London or someplace. Because after all, banking can now be done with a mouse button. The bank can be anywhere. Right? So the United States finds that it's limited in how much it can regulate them. If they make the companies angry, then the companies can leave, which means the United States or other nations like it don't have nearly as much flexibility to regulate working conditions, to regulate labor, to put in minimum wages, to put in environmental regulations, so on and so forth. Right? So you have countries all over the world that find they have much less sovereignty. And this is something that really angers a lot of people. If you looked at the Brexit election, that was the one thing more than anything else that the people in Britain were saying that voted for Brexit. They wanted to be in charge of their country. Right? So the decline of sovereignty was one consequence of this new economic system, one thing that made it very unpopular. Another consequence of this is, okay, the new global economic system has put a lot of tremendous stress on the environment, the natural environment. Right? And let me give you an example. We talked about, remember, the what you call it, the Aswan High Dam, the dam that made electricity in Egypt. Okay, when you build a dam, the water's got to go someplace. In Egypt, what it did was the backed up water wound up destroying antiquities that had been around for 6,000 years. Multiply that around the world, and you see a problem. Let me explain what I mean. Under globalization, companies are in a tremendous amount of pressure to sell stuff. That is, you have to buy what you need from the rest of the world, which means you have to sell stuff to the rest of the world in order to pay for it. So poorer countries are under a lot of pressure to produce natural raw materials to sell. Bigger companies are under a lot of pressure to produce industrial products to sell. So if the environment gets in the way of that, then the environment's got to go. That is, you looked at Brazil, you've heard the rock singers, the celebrities talk about saving the rainforest. That's what they're saving the rainforest from. The rainforest gets chopped down so that hardwoods could be sold in America. Right? Once the rainforest is gone, they grow soybeans on it. So the soybeans can be sold to China. Right? The rainforest in Indonesia is chopped down in order to provide scaffolding to build skyscrapers in Tokyo. Right? The system is designed to make sure that the countries involved make that choice, right? The choice to produce something to sell. And that can produce a lot of environmental problems. For example, if you travel around the world, you go to China, the air is terrible. But the worst of it in 2013, they have a they had air so bad that in the fall you couldn't see the sun. That is, when the sun came up, you just got this orangish brown haze in the sky that indicated it was daylight. Right? In the United States, they have an air quality index. In America and Houston, a bad day is when the air quality index gets up to about 150. Then you're not supposed to go outside, right? The U.S. Embassy put one up in the embassy in Beijing. You know what the air quality index was in the fall of 2013 at the uh, embassy in Beijing? 850. It might have been higher, except the meter only goes to 850. And in India, the air is actually worse because both countries, India and China, are under relentless pressure to sell stuff, which means they have to sell cheap, which means that they can't put in any regulations in order to protect the environment. Okay, it's the choice they got to make. And in the future, we shall see what kind of issues that generates. Actually, we're already looking at one now. The coronavirus is essentially an environmental problem. That is, agriculture has always gone hand in hand with creating epidemic diseases. In China, they have had a series of epidemics over the last 20 years because they are under relentless pressure to make stuff cheap. You've got a natural environment that's polluted, which makes it easier for new mutations, new viruses to develop. It winds up getting into their livestock and from there spreads into the human population. China, I mean, the Asian world actually reacted better to coronavirus because they've had practice. This is the third coronavirus epidemic they've had over there. They had the SARS epidemic in 2003. They had MERS in 2008. Right? So now they know how to run a quarantine better than Europe or the United States. Right? So if you have environmental problems like that, okay, can you keep the system going? Especially when you get to the big environmental problem in a generation, which is going to be the global warming, right? That is, if you've got a system where the individual nations are under tremendous amount of pressure to sell and sell cheap, can they do anything about these kind of problems? And we shall find out. Another major consequence of globalization of free trade has been the shift of world trading patterns. In World War II, the United States was the world's biggest exporter. America had half of the world's factories. But what you're looking at here is the balance of trade in the United States. Right? This is the zero line. If this red line is above here, America is selling more than it's buying. Note that the red line over here is rarely above zero. America buys more than it sells from the rest of the world. Partially, the system was designed to work like that. Since America had the money, America was going to be the buyer of last resort. If you couldn't sell your stuff anywhere else, you could sell it to the United States. Right? So you've seen the United States over the course of especially the last 50 years, increasingly importing products. Right? Things that used to be made in the United States are increasingly being made in other places. And there's a question over how sustainable that is. And actually, you're seeing problems with that now. Things like medical gear, like the uh, masks that the surgical people wear. You can't get them in the United States in the crisis now because they're not made here. Okay, they're manufactured elsewhere, especially in places like China. Right? So, and money is leaving the country. So, is this something that will enable an economy to be sustained over a long period of time? We don't know. We're going to find that out. Also, developed nations like the United States are also seeing another consequence of this, and that is that they're deindustrializing. America had half of the world's factories in 1945. However, increasingly those factories have shut down over the last 75 years. Right? They call if you go to Pittsburgh, the big football team in Pittsburgh is the Pittsburgh Steelers, because for 100 years, the center of the steel industry in the United States was Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the world's largest producer of steel. In 1978, uh, almost every steel company in Pennsylvania announced that they were laying off huge numbers of people. They call that Black Tuesday in the area. The last steel mill in Pittsburgh shut down in 1987. Today, there is no steel produced there. And over and over, you can see in the country the same thing. That is, those factories that used to dominate the United States are shut down, and the manufacturing areas around them, the towns around them, have been devastated. Right? If you get a chance to take a trip across the Midwest, you can really see that. I went to Buffalo, New York, about 5 years ago. Buffalo is depressing as all hell. That is, it used to be a factory town. When the factories went away, all you see anywhere you go now are boarded up buildings. And residential neighborhoods, you get houses abandoned, even in the ones that are pretty expensive. You go to places like Cleveland, Detroit, uh, okay, Dayton, Ohio, okay, St. Louis, Missouri, all of them are the same. They look like this. Right? That was actually one of the big influences of the 2016 election. The areas that Obama won in 2012, but that Trump won in 2016, were factory towns, places where the old manufacturing industries were shut down, and the people who were put out of work were angry. They wanted a future, and they didn't have one. And this has had tremendous amount of impacts on American society. You see the same thing going on in Britain, in Germany, in other big industrial nations from 1945. For example, what we're looking at here are wages for high school graduates. Note what direction they were going. It is going from 1973 to today. Right? It went down, and it went down specifically, particularly for men. Right? That is, if you were in 1973, if you're an 18-year-old guy without a college degree, you could go over and get a job in a steel mill, in a car factory, in a oil refinery, and you'd get paid about as much as you'd get paid as having a college degree. Actually, if you were a guy, they were a man, there was no real reason to go to college except that you wanted to go or to avoid the draft. That is no longer true. Right? That is with those factories gone, the wages for those men have gone with it. By the way, you don't see nearly as dramatic a difference among women. And this is because women really weren't doing factory work. If you were a woman in 1973, you were probably working in retail, and today you still are. So the relative decline of wages was lower for women than it was for men, but it's still down. That is, if you look at the period since 1980, this is the first time in American history that wages for unskilled laborers has actually declined in real terms when you adjust for inflation over a 30-year period. And this is the result of this economy. If you're somebody who isn't doing something competitive in the new world economy, you're going to get burned. And that's created a lot of anger. It's created a lot of desperation. And by the way, this also shows you something else which is kind of interesting. If you look at today, women make about 85 cents on the dollar to what men make, between 80 and 85 cents. If you would have been in 1973, and for college graduates, it would have been that too. That is, a woman college graduate made about 80 to 85 cents on the dollar to what a male college graduate did. However, for people who didn't go to college, the difference was even more huge back then. That is, a woman made about 60 to 70 cents on the dollar compared to a man. That was because men could go in and get those high paid factory work. When the high paid factory work went and men start working retail too, you see that particular part of the gap between men and women shift. So if you look at college graduates, though, nothing has really changed. You still see women making less than men, making about the same percentage of what men did even 50 years ago. Anyway, so if you looked around the world, you could see a lot of people who looked at globalization and said, it hurt me. Okay? It left me a world that was polluted. It cost me my job. It took money out of my pocket. It took away my future. But for others, it worked out really well. Right? And you can really see in America the winners and losers based off of education. People with college degrees do well in the new globalized world. People who didn't go to college have done poorly. That is, the manufacturing jobs that would have made them money are now gone. And so you can see why the globalization process is actually important. It shaped your decision making. That is, you decided to go to college primarily because of it. You may not have understood that this was the underlying reason, but it was ultimately what got you where you are right now, got your decision making where it is right now. That is, it created the world around you and the options around you. Right. So we're now at a crossroads with globalization in 2020. That is this something that should be abandoned because the price of it is too high? Or is this still the wave of the future? Are these problems within it solvable? That is things like, say, the environment solvable within globalization, or do you have to abandon globalization in order to fix it? Can you fix wages without globalization, or do you have to use globalization for it? Right? And what this one of the interesting questions as you all get older is you're going to find that out. We'll see if we come back in 30 years, we'll have a better idea about it. So anyway, this is how the economy changes. What I want to get into your next class is about national security and foreign policy, and we will do that in your next recording.